our kids were younger, we used to warn them that if they didn't eat their veggies, they'd end up with scurvy and rickets. For centuries, sailors and soldiers died from scurvy, which is a terrible disease, but it resulted simply from a vitamin C deficiency. Their bodies would become dotted with pus-oozing sores, their mucous membranes would bleed, their teeth would fall out. Death eventually followed simply because of a lack of vitamin C. Something that today is very understandable and very abundant for us. They struggled and had a terrible situation. Many people died as a result of just ignorance is what it comes down to. When we talk about the church in the United States, there's pretty much mutual agreement across the board that the church is far from healthy, that we are struggling with issues and with sin and so many difficulties, conflicts, whatever it might be, so many failures within the church. But why those issues are the way they are is a point of contention. The scholars, pastors, experts are looking at these issues and they're trying to explain why are we the way we are. Well, I have my own personal opinion, and since I'm the one sharing, I'll get to give that to you today. I believe that the primary problem with the church in the United States is what I would call spiritual scurvy. Spiritual scurvy, which is the result of a grace deficiency, and it's all caused by a misalignment with God's divine order. In your notebook, there's a little diagram, and it's really very, very simple. The design that God created the earth with is simply the Godhead at a place of supremacy and authority, which is the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Underneath God comes humans, and then underneath humans come creation. And it's God's order. It's the way the world is supposed to work. And as we express faith towards God, God pours out grace upon our lives. What happens when that divine order is violated is that everything gets messed up. And this is what took place in the garden. And so what happens when the order gets messed up is that you still have God in a place of supremacy because God is God. But humanity now comes under the authority of creation, or humanity becomes enslaved to the created order. And part of the created order is Lucifer himself. And so the powers of darkness are able to enslave people. The world enslaves people in many ways, simply because we separated ourselves from God. We violated the divine order. And now God is still there, but he's distant. And we're not walking in the authority and the power that he created for us. And it's just simply because of this issue of the divine order being violated. Where we're supposed to be in a place of supremacy, where we're supposed to be in a place of dominion and ruling over the world, we become subject to the created order. You know, I think a great example for me in this is hunting and fishing, two of the hobbies that I enjoy. And really, when you think about it, hunting and fishing are opportunities to go out and exercise your dominion, the dominion God has given you over creation. But myself, I've seen it in my own life at times in the past, and certainly I've seen it in plenty of other lives, where men become enslaved to their passions. Men become enslaved to their hobbies. And rather than being in a place of authority over the world, we become subject to the world. And so these things control our lives rather than us living in freedom. And it's all, again, it's as a result of a violation of God's order. The powers of darkness will always tempt humans to do one of four things. They will always tempt humans to do one of four things. They will tempt us to try to lower God. If somehow in our minds we will lower God, the divine order will be violated. They will tempt us to exalt ourselves, to lift ourselves up to the place of God. They will tempt us to worship false gods, and they will tempt us to exalt creation. Any one of these four things violates the order that God has for us. And so if you look, for example, if you look at false doctrine or false teaching that's out there, 95% of it, I would guess, could be found simply in these four issues of lowering God, exalting humans, worshiping false gods, or exalting creation. They're all wrapped up in any type of false doctrine, because the whole goal of the powers of darkness, the whole goal of Lucifer, is to bring God down and to take himself up. And that happens when we try to exalt ourselves or we exalt creation, the created order, in any way, shape, or form. So God's order is violated. We're separated from God, and we become slaves of the created order. And so this misalignment results in a grace deficiency. I like to use a hose as an illustration for this. If you think of grace as a life flow of God that comes out of heaven, when the hose is unkinked, when it's straight, there's a free flow for that grace to be able to come. It kind of reminds me of when my son was younger. I was out one time watering the garden, and just, it was hot weather, and just spraying some water on the garden, and I'm standing there holding the hose, and all of a sudden the spray just stops. I'm wondering what's going on, and I turn around and I look, and there's Mike at about 5 years old waving, and he's got the hose kinked. And we've all experienced that. When the hose kinks, the flow stops. And that's essentially what happens. Whenever we are in alignment with God's order, there's a free flow of His grace into our lives. But whenever that alignment becomes twisted, whenever somehow we are misaligned, the flow is cut off, and we end up with that grace deficiency. The New Testament puts tremendous emphasis on the importance of receiving and abiding in grace. Tremendous emphasis. Why is this? Well, grace is so important for us if we are to live the life that God calls us to live. But we fully can't understand grace's significance if we don't have a clear understanding of grace. And I believe this is one of the problems that we have with the church today in the U.S., is that we really don't have a clear comprehension of exactly what grace is. And so we want to take a look at that. The classic definition of grace is what? God's unmerited favor. And, essentially it's saying that God gives us awesome favor that we do not deserve. And I just talked about this. I talked about this in the last session, that, we become the righteousness of God in Christ. And so there's favor poured out on our lives, favor that we are undeserving of. And so this is entirely true. And I would never argue that. But I also say that grace is something more. The grace is unmerited favor, but there's much more to grace as well. Peter writes in 1 Peter 4:10, "As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." Good stewards of the manifold grace of God. And so what's he saying? He's saying that grace is multifaceted. It's multifaceted. Grace, the gifts that we have are grace gifts. Grace comes to us in many different forms and in many different expressions. And so it's much more than the unmerited favor of God. It is the unmerited favor of God towards us, but it's much more as well. Grace can be further understood as God's divine influence upon the human heart that gives us the ability to do all that God calls us to do. Grace can be understood as God's divine influence on the human heart that gives us the ability to do all that God calls us to do. Grace is the life flow from heaven and enables us to do everything that God would call us to do in life, whether it be some sort of action, whether it be some kind of obedience, giving, or living in victory or mastery over the power of sin. Grace is the power and the ability for us to do all of those things. One of the best illustrations of grace that I've ever seen comes from the book Les Miserables, and it's by Victor Hugo. It's also a movie. There's been plays that have done on it. Hugo was brilliant, and it was staged in France years ago, and the main character is a young man by the name of Jean Valjean. And Jean Valjean is a woodcutter. He comes from a poor family. The time of the year is in the winter, and so there's very little work for him to do. He's not able to prune trees or any of that type of stuff. And it's a horrid situation. You have people that are very wealthy and in power, and then you have others in squalid poverty. And he was in poverty, and he lived with his sister who had children. They had no money. They had no food. The children were sick. They were starving. And so in a weak moment, he breaks into a store and he steals a loaf of bread. Well, he wasn't a very good thief, and so he got caught. And he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, in a horrible prison called Tulane, which was the conditions were horrid, essentially, is what it came down to. And so while he's in prison, he decides he's going to try to escape. And so he makes a break for it, and he wasn't a very good escape artist either, and so he gets caught. Not only does he do this once, he does this 3 times. Tries to escape and gets caught 3 times. And so 5 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread becomes 19 years in these horrible conditions. Finally, Jean Valjean is paroled, and he's released into society. However, he receives this yellow passport, which is essentially his papers of identification. And by law, he is now required that wherever he goes, he has to show his passport. So whenever he would go to somewhere to try to find a place to sleep or to eat or whatever, as soon as they realize that he's an ex-con, the people want to have nothing to do with him. And so he's ostracized. So here he is, having spent 19 years in jail, removed from society, horrible situation, and now he's free, but he's not really free because he can't do anything. He can't go anywhere. He can't eat. And so in misery, he lays down on a park bench. And as he's laying on this bench, some lady walks up to him and points him towards a house. And she says, "If you need help, go knock on that door." Not knowing what else to do, he goes and he knocks on the door. and a priest, Catholic priest, answers the door. And you would have thought that it was the priest's brother. The way the priest treats him is just incredible. He brings him in, begins conversation with him. He doesn't have a lot financially, but what he does have, he shares. And so he has the housekeeper bring the best meal that they can provide. He brings out the best silver that they have, which is really the only thing of value that they own. Brings that out, treats him like a king. Has a wonderful evening, just kind of in unbelief about the way things go. The priest offers him a place to stay. And so he gives him a nice bed, and it's the first time in 19 years that he's actually slept in a bed that is decent to any degree. And so he lays down and he has a really good sleep for about 4 hours, and then he wakes up. And with the mind of a criminal, he can't stop thinking about the silver. And he lays there in bed for an hour debating whether or not he should steal the silver or just receive the benefit of what he's had already. And so after an hour, he finally decides, I'm going to steal that silver. And so he gets up, he gets his stuff, and he has this metal pipe that he'd been carrying with him, and he begins creeping towards the room. He has to go through the priest's bedroom to get the silver and then to leave. And so he's walking through the priest's bedroom, and as he's going through, he looks over and he sees the priest asleep. And at that very moment, the moonlight begins to shine through the window, and the priest almost looks angelic. And he stands there, kind of caught, riveted in time, realizing the contrast between this priest who is so benevolent and generous and loving, and himself, who is this miserable wretch of a man now who has become so hardened and angry with life. And he's tempted to take the pipe and just to crush his skull and to kill him because of the contrast and the misery that he sees within himself. At the last second, he decides he's not going to do that. He does go, he grabs the silver, puts it in a sack, and he takes off. The next morning rolls around, the housekeeper's all upset because the silver's gone. The priest is saying something like, well, he probably needed it more than we did, that type of a thing. And there's a knock at the door. It's the police. And they have Jean Valjean. And so the police say, Father, this criminal told us that you gave him this silver. And the priest walks up to him and says, Jean Valjean, I'm so angry with you. Why didn't you take the candlesticks? You took the silver, but you forgot the candlesticks. Why didn't you take them? They're worth a lot of money. And so everybody at this point is totally dumbfounded. You know, the housekeeper's kind of beside herself. The police are all like, what are you talking? I can't believe this. And so they're dismissed and they leave. And so we see Jean Valjean standing there in front of the priest, eye to eye. And the priest looks at him and says, do not forget, never forget, you've promised to use this money to become an honest man. And by this time, he's broken. And in the movie, it's a great scene. He says, promised. Why are you doing this? And he just doesn't have a clue. He can't comprehend the kindness of the priest. And the priest says, Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. And the scene closes. This picture of grace is extremely powerful. Does the priest show Jean Valjean unmerited favor? Absolutely, shows him a favor that he does not deserve. But he also gives him the silver. And by giving him the silver, he gave him the ability to live a new life. If he didn't have the money, if he didn't have the ability to go out and to earn a living or to somehow feed himself, he was destined for a life of crime. And this gives us a picture of God's desire for us and God's provision for us. You know, if God would save us and just leave us at that, if he would save us and say, okay, I want you to live a righteous life or a moral life or a good life or whatever, and not give us the ability to live that life, would he be a loving God? Absolutely not. So not only does God save us, not only does he give us favor that we don't deserve, he gives us grace, which is the power to live the life that he calls us to live. He gives us the silver so that we can be new people. It's a powerful picture of grace, and it really is what grace is all about. It's the life flow of God that enables us to do whatever God calls us to do. God both forgives and empowers with grace. And like water in the ocean, God has an abundance of grace to pour out on our lives. There is absolutely no shortage of grace in heaven.